Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Ryan Weber. I'm a senior researcher here at Nordregio. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the Nordic Economic Policy Review, which is an annual publication funded by the Nordic Committee of Senior Officials for Finance. This year's issue presents some of the latest and cutting-edge research on economic policy relating to the housing sector. Throughout the Nordic region, the total value of our housing stock amounts to about 120 to 150% of our annual GDP. The construction sector is Europe's largest sector by employment. And for those of us living in larger urban areas, on average, we spend well over 30% of our disposable income on housing every month. So whether we're talking about a consumption perspective, a production perspective, or issues of taxation and policy, it's clear that this housing issue is very central both to our economy and to our society in terms of well-being. This year's Nordic Economic Policy Review dives into pressing issues such as the presence of housing bubbles, the phenomenon of buy-to-let or buy-to-rent as an investment strategy, housing taxation and neutrality between ownership and rent and the rental market, as well as construction costs and the development of construction costs, especially in Sweden, and the issue of affordable housing in terms of accessibility, affordability, and integration. What's unique about it, like all Nordic economic policy reviews, is it has this cross-Nordic perspective. So while compiling these articles, we're able to develop an integrated Nordic perspective, a comparative perspective that we can then use to share and learn and create additional learning opportunities. So today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this launch. We're joined here today with all of you, with co-editors, with authors, and key representatives in the housing sectors who will join us today to not only present some of the key findings in terms of the content of the issue, but also to inspire discussion and debate together with you, the audience. So I'm very much looking forward to the next couple of hours to share it with you. So on behalf of Finland's 2021 presidency of the Nordic Council of Ministers, I would like to welcome Krista Mikkonen to join us. Krista is the Minister of Environment and Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment in Finland, which has responsibility for housing issues in Finland. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Krista, to provide the opening word.
Thank you, Ryan, and good afternoon. Dear Nordic friends, housing has taken a particularly high significance in people's lives during the past year, as people around the world have been forced to stay at home. The COVID pandemic will certainly have a long-lasting impact. People's housing preferences and lifestyles may have changed permanently. The extent of these changes and the exact definition, those we don't know yet. The only certain thing seems to be uncertainty. The housing market is extremely important for the national economy as a whole, but is also important because it is at the heart of people's lives. The importance of home, housing, and housing policy in society has been reinforced by the pandemic even more. This year, the Nordic Economic Policy Review has focused on this important issue, housing policy, and raised a few key issues about rising housing market prices, the impact of social security, and segregation. Perhaps contrary to the expectations, housing market prices have risen to record highs during the COVID crisis. This has largely been the result of extensive stimulus measures. Healthy housing market is often a sign that the whole economy is doing well. The Nordic countries and Finland are also at the forefront of developing a functional social housing policy although there are surprisingly large differences between the Nordic countries too. That is exactly why it is important to have valid research on these topics, as we will see and hear today in this event. Some of the topics we will soon learn more about include prevalence of housing bubbles, the effects of the rental market on housing prices, cost and productivity of housing construction, and social housing production. But before we turn into those interesting topics, as the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, I would like to say a few words about another important theme: housing and climate. Dear friends, the large climate impact of buildings and homes is an important challenge for housing policy. About 1/3 of the sector's carbon footprint comes from the construction phase. Heating of premises causes from 30 to 50% of housing emissions. Climate action to reduce climate impact of housing and construction sector will be an important part of our path to climate neutrality. In Finland, district heating equals almost half of the market share, and it is a very common form of heating also in other Nordic countries. District heating offers great emission reduction potential when combined with, for example, industrial or data center waste heat or geothermal heat with heat pumps. District heating system can also store energy in a very efficient manner. Although district heating emissions have already decreased, fossil fuel use is still very common. This is part of the reason building sector has large emissions also in Finland. We need to move district heating away from fossil fuels and burning. Finland already has a law banning the energy use of coal starting from May 2029. Helsinki will replace coal by a combination of different technologies: geothermal energy, extracting heat from the water, as well as by heat from waste, wind power, and so on, as well as using bioenergy. The second key element of climate efforts in the housing sector relate to improving energy efficiency of buildings. Here we have already done a lot of good work in Finland as well as in other Nordic countries. In construction, in line with the EU goals, we have shifted to almost zero energy construction. Still, a lot remains to be done in order to make sure that our homes, buildings, and housing markets are fit for the ever-changing world and the challenges and possibilities it presents to us. This is why events like the one today are really important. Let's share our ideas, knowledge, and best practices for the common good, as the challenges and possibilities are more or less the same for all of us. With these words, I wish you all warmly welcome and hope you will have an interesting and educational day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krista. It's very nice that you've pointed out both the COVID issue, and I think that this is something we're certainly going to be taking up in the discussion and the panel discussion today, the impacts of COVID on the housing market and housing trends, and as well, certainly the issue of integrating policy together between climate issues and housing issues, say, from an economic or social perspective. So thank you very much for that. In a moment, I will give the floor to Harry Flam, Professor Emeritus from the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University, together with Peter Englund, Professor Emeritus at the Stockholm School of Economics, Harry and Peter have co-edited this year's Nordic Economic Policy Review issue. They will introduce the publication to us and lead us towards 3 presentations that will focus in on content from specific articles in the issue. But first, I'm joined here by my colleague, Johanne Westhoff, who will just give us a little bit of information about how the next couple of hours are going to go and how you, the audience, can participate and join the conversation.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to have you here with us. After Harry's presentation, we will hear 3 author presentations out of the 5 that are in the publication. And after each presentation, there will be room for questions, both from Ryan, but also from you, the audience. And the second part will be a panel, an expert panel, which hopefully will lead to lots of interesting discussions. And I will be behind the scenes right here, ready for your questions in the chat. So please follow along and share your questions and thoughts on the topics. So over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Johanna. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Harry Flam to the screen to give us an introduction to the content and find some of the findings and overview of this year's issue. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Well, housing plays a central role for people's welfare, and typically the share of household income going to housing is about 25% on average. And that's more than any other item in a typical household's budget. So it's not surprising that issues that relate to housing figure very much in public discussion. Examples of issues that are discussed frequently are social and ethnic segregation in the housing markets, the high increase of housing that we have seen in the past decades, and rising costs of construction, rising costs of land, affordability of housing, or I should rather say unaffordability of housing, especially for young people and others with low income and little savings, and increasing levels of mortgage debt and the associated risk for financial instability. This issue of the Nordic Economic Policy Review is devoted to Nordic housing markets and housing policies. Nordic housing markets face more or less the same problems and challenges, but the ways policies and regulations deal with these differ in many respects. And a comparison of policies, regulations, and results across countries can yield valuable lessons for policymakers. The 5 articles in this issue cover some of the most important issues in the housing markets. There is an article about the reasons for large price increases of owner-occupied housing and the prevalence of bubbles in the housing markets. If investing in housing for profit amplifies price increases, the reasons for the large increase in the relative cost of construction, how housing taxation can improve social welfare, and how housing can be made more affordable for low-income households. And also how policies in the housing market can exacerbate or alleviate social and ethnic segregation. Now, we only have time to present and discuss 3 of the 5 papers in the journal. Let me therefore say a few words about the 2 that are not presented today. The first of these is by André Anundsen from Norway and deals with the large price increases of owner-occupied housing over the last 2 decades. And the second that is not presented today is by Erlend Bø, also from Norway, and deals with the effects of allowing the purchase of individual housing units for the purpose of renting them out, so-called buy-to-let. In recent years or decades, house prices have risen to historically high levels all over the world, not least in the Nordic countries. In Norway and Sweden, prices have continued to rise almost without interruption over the recent quarter century. In Denmark, in contrast, the price boom in the years leading up to the financial crisis was broken by a dramatic price fall, and house prices have yet to come back to the 2007 peak, at least as of 2019. In Finland, the price developments have been less dramatic, with more modest price increases before the financial crisis and more or less constant prices thereafter. There are many fundamental reasons behind these developments, including increasing incomes, rapid urbanization, lower interest rates, financial liberation, and a favorable tax treatment of housing. But there are also concerns that fundamentals alone cannot fully account for the price increases, and that there may be elements of speculation and irrational expectations involved. The paper by Onensen looks for indications of price bubbles of owner-occupied one-family houses. And he compares actual prices with prices predicted by fundamentals, disposable income, changes in the housing stock, and the interest rate. He finds that Danish house prices appear to have been strongly overvalued before 2008. And so there seems to be have been a price bubble in the Danish housing market at that time. Now, at the end of the period, he finds no other evidence of price bubbles in the housing markets in the other Nordic countries. And his data run up to 2019. At the end of the period, house prices in Norway and Sweden seem to be somewhat overvalued. Now, I should add that since 2019, prices of owner-occupied housing, especially of single-family dwellings, have risen about 25%, which is exceptional historically. And at the end of the period also, prices in Denmark and Finland seem to be slightly undervalued compared to fundamentals. Now, a significant segment of the rental housing markets in Helsinki and Oslo consists of buy-to-let. The buy-to-let segment is smaller in Copenhagen due to rent regulation, and it is practically non-existent in Stockholm due to rent regulation and restrictions on subletting. It has been argued that the existence of buy-to-let has amplified the increase in housing prices. Now, Erlend Bø simulates prices in Helsinki and Oslo without the buy-to-let sector. And he finds that the increase in house prices would have been only 60% of the actual house price increases without a buy-to-let sector. And analogously, he simulates the Stockholm housing market with a buy-to-let sector and finds that the actual price increases have been about 40% higher than, the price increase with the buy-to-let sector would have been much higher if such a sector would have existed, which it does not. So the evidence from Oslo, Helsinki, and Stockholm indicates that the existence of a buy-to-let sector serves to amplify price increases. Now, the Nordic Economic Policy Review is published online, and it's available to everyone, so you can see more details about the papers that I've talked about and the other papers there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. I'm just waiting for my screen to come on.
There you go.
There we are. Yes, thank you, Harry. I think you've covered a lot of the what and the when of a lot of the key issues that we're going to be discussing today, and also profiling the two articles that we don't have specific presentations for. So thank you very much. So it's I look forward now to digging into the how and the why of some of these key issues that you've brought up through our three articles. And first of all, I would like to introduce Sten Nyberg and Mats Bergman, who have written an article about housing prices, construction costs, and competition in the Swedish construction sector. Sten is a professor of economics and head of Department of Economics at Stockholm University. His research concerns applied economic theory, and he has a special interest in issues of competition. Sten has also served as chief economist at the Swedish Competition Authority. Co-authoring with Sten is Mats Bergman, as I mentioned, who is a professor of economics at Södertörn University and has also previously been chief economist at the Swedish Competition Authority. His research focuses on markets, competition, regulation, and public procurement. For the past few years, Mats has also been affiliated with reInvent, a multidisciplinary research center focusing on cities for co-production with city builders and planners. Sten, I believe it will be you hosting the presentation, and then we'll come back with you, Mats, for questions in the follow-up and also in the panel. Welcome, Sten. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Let me share my presentation. Let's see. And we want to do share here. Unfortunately, slideshow present to you. Now, can you see my presentation now?
Looks great.
Good. Well, thank you. As Ryan said, I will be talking about house prices, construction cost, and competition in the construction sector. And we will have a Swedish perspective primarily, but we'll also compare a little bit with other countries. Let me first start with a brief outline and brief overview of the questions we'll address in the paper. First, we'll look at the housing prices have increased over the last 20 years. We'll discuss how much of the increase that is due to rising land prices, which is a key explanatory factor in the economic literature. And we'll move on to look at the development of construction costs and its causes. And there we'll find that it turns out that Sweden differs from other countries here, and we'll discuss the potential causes for this, and we'll end with some concluding comments. So first, housing prices. And this graph is pretty much what Harry described so eloquently just a minute ago. So in yellow, we see the Swedish house price development, and in blue, the Norwegian. And then we see this little hump there for Denmark and so on, as Harry described. The only thing that perhaps was not in that discussion was, you see also light blue dotted line that is almost horizontal, and that's the housing price development in Germany, and that goes to illustrate that the rise has not been the same across the board in Germany and in the US, which is not in this picture, and prices have been more stable. But in the Nordic country, we've seen a substantial rise. So why do house prices increase? Well, prices are determined by supply and demand, And several economic drivers of housing demand have developed positively over time. For instance, population growth, income growth, and we also seen falling interest rates. But demand expansion alone does not drive prices. Supply has to be constrained in some way and not be fully elastic. If new housing would be mass produced at a constant cost, then prices wouldn't go up. So we need to look at factors that may constrain supply, and those include scarcity in land and imperfect competition, but also things like planning, regulation, or zoning laws, etc. Finally, we should also note that higher prices of housing could reflect better products, simply that there are different kind of housing that is produced now. So that's something we would need to control for, but can be difficult to control for. First off, we'll look at land prices, which is in the economic literature has been argued to account for most of the increase in housing prices. Some have even argued that land use regulation is an even more important factor than land scarcity in this regard. So in this picture here, we see the cost of land per square meter for different categories of housing. So the blue line on top reflects the land cost for condominiums in large cities, and the green line just under it is single-family homes in large cities. And at the bottom, we see rental apartments in the rest of Sweden. So, and then we have some categories in between there. So not surprisingly, the largest increases have been in large cities, and in particular for condominiums. And as for construction costs, these have also gone up. So here again, we see the same categories of housing and the increases over time. And again, it's the cooperative housing in large cities that is on top, which is perhaps not so surprising. So as we saw, both land prices and construction costs per square meter has increased considerably. Even taking inflation into account, the increases are substantial. So real construction prices doubled over 25 years. Land prices actually quadrupled for single family homes and even more so for co-ops in large cities. So with that in mind, how much of the increase in housing prices can be attributed to rising land prices? Well, it turns out that it's less than 30%, and the reason is that land prices only accounted for about 10% of the housing price in 1998 when the series started. So even though the increases have been large, we start out with a small share, so therefore the impact is a little bit more limited than one might expect. So we saw that both land prices and construction costs go up, and we might ask how they relate to housing prices and if they do interact. The first point on this slide is a simple intuition that says that land price should equal housing price minus construction cost. And the intuition for that would be that for a given willingness to pay for housing, you might expect higher construction costs to be absorbed by lower land prices. So simply, if a buyer is not willing to pay more, but it costs more to build, then builders will offer less for land. However, that's a very simple intuition, and that changes if you take into account mobility and factor substitution. And in the paper, we present a little model illustrating how these forces interact. But here I'll just mention that two examples. So in areas where land prices can't fall because prices are determined by some alternative use of land, say agriculture, a rise in construction costs would make housing relatively more expensive than in areas where land prices can fall. And this would shift demand to areas where land prices can fall and dampen this fall. Also, if construction costs rise, it becomes optimal to use less capital and more land when producing housing. And this drives up the demand for land and thus land prices. This is the exact opposite implication from our original intuition. Conversely, if instead land prices rise, it becomes optimal to use less land and more capital when producing housing. So if we see rising land prices, we would expect to see taller buildings or more luxurious housing, which we see in large cities. And this just goes to say that high land prices may raise construction costs per square meter without this being a sign of low productivity or weak competition. So let's now move over to look at how construction costs have developed over time. So these are construction costs for the same countries that we saw in the initial slides. And here we see the green line representing Sweden is way above the other line. So construction costs have increased more in Sweden than in other countries. But we can also decompose this and look at labor cost index and building materials index. And if we do that, we can see that when it comes to labor cost, the Swedish labor cost in the construction sector has risen, but we have a light blue line here representing Denmark, where they have gone up even more. So there it's a little bit more of a mixed story. Now looking at building material price index, here Sweden does stand out alone. So the Swedish development of the price index for building materials is exceptional. So we'll need to look into that a little bit. Now, building material index covers a broad spectrum of products, and the development of these differ a lot. For instance, cement, a notoriously monopolized market, has seen rather modest price increases, actually less than consumer price index during the 80s and early 90s. If we compare that and cement would be a hashed blue, dark blue line at the bottom. We look at the two top lines, that's installation equipment and cables and conduction respectively. And there have been on a completely different track. I don't know if you can see the scales here, but we're starting off in 1984, so it's way back. But then again, looking at the development of the index, it's at 2000 at the top, going from 100. So it's a substantial increase. And it levels off around 2010. So why do construction costs and materials costs rise in Sweden? When it comes to construction costs, as mentioned before, there are a number of drivers of construction costs. Land use regulation can be an important factor driving up costs. Also, the lengthy administrative processes to receive permits, etc., add to cost. When it comes to building materials, as we saw, they're very heterogeneous, but some of the main culprits here are sold through wholesale channels that have experienced substantial consolidation and have a very high market concentration. Also in these channels, there is a lack of price transparency due to a system of substantial rebates. So rebates can mean different things. For one thing, high rebates means that the cost increase could be overstated, meaning that the actual prices that builders pay might be less than the ones that are registered in the statistic. On the other hand, a rebate system, depending on how they're designed, if they're conditional rebates, can also lessen competition substantially and foster strong loyalty to certain wholesalers. So that's one part that can increase cost. And so one thing that haven't been extensively looked at before, but I know that Swedish Competition Authority is looking at it right now. I thought I should also mention the construction of rental housing. So the rental housing sector is quite large in Sweden and can have an impact on the competition when it comes to or the pricing of building materials and so on. So there are signs of weak competition in the procurement of rental housing. So the statistic reveals that there are quite a few procurement auctions where there are very few bidders. So that's not uncommon. And you would expect bidders to anticipate that and adjust prices accordingly. Also, Sweden has an effectual rent control system in place, and to stimulate new construction, they have instituted rent setting provisions for new housing that differ a little bit. And they're essentially a cost plus regulation, a rate of return regulation. So it means that if you have higher cost in construction, you get compensated and can set a higher rent. So that stimulates construction, and it seems to have worked that way. So we have more construction after that. But it also dampens the incentives for cost control and could explain some rising costs. So I'll conclude and say that we found steep increases in construction materials cost in Sweden as compared to other countries. And land cost increases can explain only part of the housing cost increase. Raised construction costs can increase land costs when land is scarce. And the rent regulation, as I just mentioned, can serve to increase construction cost. And also we've seen indication that some material costs have risen excessively and competition in some segments may be weak, and indication that bid competition for new housing is weak. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and leave the word to Ryan.
Thanks very much, Sten, and also Mats for your insightful work in developing that article. Maybe just one quick question before we move along. You had some interesting commentary in the beginning of your article. Sweden, for instance, has the lowest share of new housing construction per capita, per population growth, and also, I believe, per GDP. When we think of this, on one hand, the low development of the supply of housing, and on the other hand, lots of potential explanatory factors for what's driving up these prices, it sounds to me like we have some sort of imbalance in here. What would be your response to this general concern that you state in your article in relation to these trends when comparing it to the other Nordic countries?
I can start off. Well, as I mentioned, there are several things hampering construction in Sweden, and the lengthy processes to get permits is one, and also there are in numerous government inquiries, it's brought up that there are municipal building codes that differ, and all these things can slower construction. And also this, when I talked about this provisions for setting rental housing, that was instituted maybe 15 years ago, a little less than that. And that was in direct response on the low supply of new housing. So it's been a very long period where it was deficient. And then it took off a little bit, and it's slightly better.
Thank you very much. I certainly invite all of you that are participating to grab a copy from norden.org of the publication and have a look at detail. There are some very convincing arguments and cases to be made about some of these construction sector challenges or issues behind that contribute to rising housing prices. So thanks very much. Sten and Mats, will welcome you back in a little while for the panel discussion. Next, I would like to welcome Essi Eerola, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who is Research Director of Finland's VATT Institute for Economic Research. Essi is specialized in taxation, housing markets, housing policy, and has been VATT's leading economist since 2008. In 2015 and 16, she also served in an advisory role in the research unit of the Bank of Finland's Monetary Policy and Research Department. Essi's article deals with a hot topic for all of us in Nordic countries: low-income housing, affordability, accessibility, and integration. Welcome, Essi.
Thank you, Ryan. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my presentation. let me know when
Looks great.
when things are okay. Ryan, do you see my presentation?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Essi Eerola, and I'm from VATT Institute for Economic Research. We are a research institute located in Helsinki, focusing on policy evaluation, issues related to labor markets, social security, taxation, climate, and housing. So my topic today is low-income housing policies, affordability, and integration. So as has been discussed already during the previous talks, governments subsidize and regulate housing consumption and construction in many different ways. These programs and policies have often also conflicting goals, one of them being increasing housing affordability and housing standards, especially for low-income households, prevention of segregation in large cities, ensuring macroeconomic stability, especially after the financial crisis, promoting home ownership and labor mobility. Now, these issues are likely to become even more important in the future, and one of the reasons for that is urbanization. Urbanization creates large economic benefits, but poses also challenges for social sustainability, for instance, by increasing housing costs. And as was already noted in the chat, it's indeed very interesting to see that, for instance, in Finland, we see large differences in the development of housing costs. Especially after the financial crisis, there has been this divergence in house prices, increasing prices in large and growing cities, and decreasing prices in other areas. But also, interestingly, quite different development within large cities in different neighborhoods. So in this article, I focus on the low-income housing policies, and I want to discuss two different issues. First, I talk about general principle and characteristics of these policies in the Nordic countries. And second, I present research on the effects of these programs in Finland. Now, some of the main findings in the article go as follows. So first of all, when we think about these programs, it's typical to divide them into two different types of programs. We have tenant-based programs like housing benefits or housing allowances. On the other hand, these are transfers directly to certain types of individuals or households. And then we have place-based policies. On the other hand, one example being social housing, and these are programs that where the target group is sort of tied to a housing unit or a building. Now, both of these programs exist in many different forms and often coexist in any given country, but they do share some common features. Now, of course, one of the features being that they improve the living standards of the recipient households, which is clearly the main objective of these programs. And on the other hand, they incur costs for the taxpayers. And this is an interesting and important issue, especially because it's not easy to compare these costs of the programs. When we look at housing benefits or housing allowances, they often the costs often imply direct budgetary costs, which are relatively transparent and easy to observe. But when we think about the costs imposed by social housing programs, they are sometimes subsidies, but to a large extent, they are foregone revenue, especially for municipalities. And in general, we have very little information about the size of these foregone revenues. And this makes it very difficult to compare the size of these different types of programs. And of course, both of these programs, depending on the details of the design, may be designed in a manner that increases demand for housing. And if this happens, these programs also have overall effects on the overall rent level, as was discussed in the previous presentation. Now, in principle, both can be useful in reducing residential segregation in large cities by affecting neighborhood sorting. Now, what we know from research is that in practice, actually housing benefits may be more efficient in achieving this ideal than social housing. This means that even in settings like in Finland, where residential segregation or prevention of residential segregation and the balanced creation of balanced neighborhoods is an explicit aim of this social housing program, it may be difficult to design the program in a manner that actually achieves this ideal. Now, there may be many reasons for this, but presumably one of them is clearly related to the fact that households choose their locations, they choose their neighborhoods, and these choices depend on the characteristics of the neighborhoods, the amenities available in the neighborhood, public and private services, as well as income. And all these issues together tend to lead to strong forces leading to residential sorting and segregation. But I think it's important to notice and recognize also that these programs have effects beyond the participants' households. One important issue is that there is a difficult tension between targeting scarce resources to low-income households or households in financial need, and on the other hand, creating socially mixed and balanced neighborhoods. Now, I think it would be useful to distinguish two different issues here. Now, high housing costs in general, I think it's a distinct problem from providing housing subsidies or other assistance for low-income households. These are different types of problems, and they call for different types of solutions. When we think about the overall housing affordability, it's likely to come in the form of increased housing supply than subsidizing demand. But when we look at the non-participants of the programs more generally, of course, we observe that one of the effects on them is the tax burden associated with financing these programs. But on the other hand, we know that many of the effects of these programs operate through the housing market and through price changes. And we currently need more research on those not targeted by the programs. For instance, by the cost of housing or through residential sorting. But I think it's nevertheless important to recognize and acknowledge these effects on these overall effects and take them into account when designing policies. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Essi. You brought up a question or a comment in your article that a place-based approach is perhaps not as transparent in the distribution of housing allowance or funds than a means-based approach. Can you just explain that clarification further and perhaps how that again relates to the issue of integration and neighborhood segregation?
Yeah, thank you for raising this issue. It's a very important point relating to how to design policies. And when we think about social housing, especially if one of the characteristics is rent regulation and providing rents below market levels. When doing so, almost the definition of providing services below market prices is that there will be queues. And therefore, we need some other way to allocate these units than the rent itself. And in many programs, of course, we have certain criteria how to choose households. But it's very difficult to ensure that households in similar situation will be treated in the same manner. To take one very extreme example, if we are two applicants and are in a very similar situation, but there's only one unit. It's impossible to treat us similarly within the program. But of course, housing allowances or housing benefits do not pitch a similar problem to the extent that the rules of the programs are very transparent. Therefore, two similar households or individuals can and will be treated similarly within the program.
Mm-hmm. Also, you have a table in the publication. You didn't show it in your presentation, but I thought it was a rather interesting table, at least the statistics it shows. Very different shares of GDP that goes towards affordable housing or housing allowances, I should say, with, I believe, 0.9 and 0.7% of GDP being allocated to housing allowances in Denmark and Finland, and then down as low as 0.1 to 0.3 in countries like Sweden and Norway and Iceland or Denmark, etc. Why such a big difference here? This is when we're talking about basis points on GDP, this is a lot of money. Where are these big differences coming from?
This is very interesting, and even more generally, the differences between the Nordic housing policies in many ways are quite starking. Big differences in the principles and in the actual design. And when you look at housing allowances and benefits, Finland seems to be an outlier relative to other Nordic countries in the sense that the housing allowance system is fairly general, covers essentially all households in Finland, conditional on certain income level. While in Sweden, the system is much more restricted and targeted towards certain types of households. And this in itself explains, I think, a large share of these differences. Also in Finland, the system has been extended during the last couple of years, and more households have become eligible. But I think it's also important when comparing these figures to try to relate them more to the overall social security system. In Finland, the housing allowance is very much part of our social security system and should be sort of assessed within that situation also.
I know at least in Sweden with our rents regulation, and sometimes we often say we have a huge percentage of our housing stock is social housing, if it's, lumping together this rent-controlled housing. But there are obviously a whole bunch of issues with that in terms of accessibility, both the queues and the need for jobs and certain income. So it's a complex question that I think takes some value from this comparative perspective. And I see Rebecca in the chat asked a question about this. How is housing affordability defined in the different countries? And is it integrated into housing policies? She provides the example of Norway. The nurse index is used as an indicator to measure affordability in the different cities. Is there anything similar that you're aware of in other Nordic countries, for instance, in Finland?
Yeah, again, very important point. Thank you. So housing affordability, it's indeed a very difficult concept because even when I look at the discussion in Finland, people tend to use it differently. They refer to different things, and I discussed this in my article. It raises some issues of confusion, but I think the main problem with affordability as a concept is that oftentimes it tends to mix two different problems: low financial means or low income and high housing costs. And if we look at a single measure, we don't know which one we're talking about. Therefore, I think it's important to look housing costs as such, and then look at the distribution of income as another measure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I where we're going to go next might not directly answer your question, Rebecca, but I think it could certainly help. And that will be to welcome. Before that, thank you again, Essi, for your presentation. I would like to welcome Niku Määttänen to the screen. Niku is Professor of Macroeconomics at the University of Helsinki and Helsinki Graduate School of Economics. His research interests include public finance, housing markets, and macroeconomics. He's prepared an article for us in this year's issue of the Housing Review, or the Economic Policy Review, Housing Taxation in the Nordics, Efficiency and Equity, which deals with various different forms of housing taxation and this relationship of neutrality between owner-occupied and rental housing. So welcome to the screen, Niku. Please take it away.
So you should now be seeing my slides.
Yes.
All right, so good. So thank you. So indeed, my topic is housing taxation in the Nordics. By equity, I refer here to the distributional aims or goals of taxation, and by efficiency, I essentially mean, well, refer to the idea that usually we try to, would like to minimize the impact that taxation has on the behavior of individual citizens or households. And one way to achieve that is to try to treat similar activities in a similar way in the tax system. Now, in the paper, I discuss a number of issues related to housing taxation. In this short presentation, I want to focus on just two things. So I will first briefly discuss the tax treatment of owner-occupied housing versus rental housing, including also the tax treatment of mortgage borrowing. After that, I try to link that discussion of the current housing taxation to recent macroprudential policies, which seek to promote macroeconomic stability via various regulations that restrictions related to the housing market and especially mortgage borrowing. So let me start with the tax treatment of owner-occupied housing vis-a-vis private rental housing. So most countries, or mostly most sort of developed or Western countries, tend to favor owner-occupied housing over private rental housing. And usually the main reason for this is that rental income, so the income received by a landlord, is subject to capital income taxation, but there's no equivalent tax on the so-called imputed rent of owner-occupied housing. So I think an easy way to see, to see this sort of tax asymmetry is to think about two households, both initially living in their own apartments or houses. Now, if we imagine that they were to switch their apartments so that they would rent their apartments to each other, so both of these households would then become landlords. Now, the aggregate tax revenue collected by government would increase, and it would actually, in many cases increase substantially relative to the overall tax revenue collected from this from just two households. Again, the reason for this is that in this case, these households would switch from being owner occupiers to becoming landlords, and the rental income would be taxed as capital income taxation. So tax revenue would increase, even though arguably, total wealth of these households is unaffected, and also the housing consumption is essentially the same. So this example illustrates what I see as the sort of fundamental tax advantage of owner-occupied housing. Another major tax advantage of owner-occupied housing is that capital gains on principal residences are usually untaxed, whereas capital gains on rental housing are taxed as capital income. Now, similar tax, so the similar features apply to most countries, and they are also present in the Nordics. Although, interestingly, I should mention that Iceland appears to have a tax on the imputed rent. It's one of the few countries having a tax on the imputed rent. And then Denmark and Sweden, they impose higher property taxes on owner-occupied housing than rental housing. So there are some important details here if one looks more closely at individual Nordic countries. Most Nordic countries also allow deducting mortgage interest payments from taxable income. Actually, in Finland is going to be an exception, that in the sense that this deduction is currently being phased out here in Finland. This, the tax deductibility, in my view, should not be seen as a major tax non-neutrality. It actually, I think the proper way of interpreting this tax deduction is that it extends the fundamental tax benefit of owner-occupied housing to those who need a mortgage to finance their owner housing. In the paper, I try to explain in more detail, why this is so, but here it perhaps suffices to note that, of course, this sort of follows the usual tax treatment of debt. And landlords obviously are also allowed to deduct mortgage interest payments from their taxable income. So there's nothing, specifically, there's nothing very distorting about this deduction. Although, of course, it should be said that the tax deduction for mortgage interest rates or mortgage interest payments would be more natural if the return to owner-occupied housing was taxed as well. So what should we think about the fact? I think that we usually favor owner-occupied housing over rental housing. From the efficiency perspective, the obvious problem here seems to be that we are very likely to induce some households that would otherwise prefer rental housing to choose owner-occupied housing instead, because of these features of the tax system, and that's that per se is problematic. One argument here, or sort of one argument, sort of trying to rationalize this type of this asymmetric tax treatment of owner and rental housing, is that somehow we would like to encourage people to become homeowners, because home ownership somehow makes people better citizens. So the specific argument here usually relates to the idea that homeowners are more likely to engage in various social activities. I have never been very convinced about that argument, and my reading of the related empirical literature is that there is really quite little evidence for that. On the other hand, and this relates to the equity perspective, what is clear is that homeowners tend to be wealthier, tend to have higher incomes than renters. So against that fact, it seems clear that favoring owner-occupied housing over rental housing is sort of problematic in terms of the equity considerations. And interestingly, it runs counter to the strong emphasis on reducing income inequality that we usually have here in the Nordic countries. Now, the other issue I wanted to raise up here is the link between housing taxation and macroprudential policies. So the decline in interest rates over the last few decades have led to higher house prices and increased household leverage. From the individual point of view, I think this is somehow very understandable. Owner-occupied housing is cheaper than rental housing, partly because of taxation. And also there's sort of a little need for private pension saving here in the Nordics because of the relatively generous mandatory pension system. So, individuals, it's understandable that individuals want to borrow against housing. However, central bankers especially are getting increasingly concerned about increased household leverage. So the issue here is that, or the main concern is that even a moderate fall in house prices might put many households into financial distress. And this is easy to see if one considers a household that has a very valuable house with high mortgage, say a 90% loan to value mortgage, and then no other assets or loans. So a moderate fall in house prices would then reduce the net worth of this household quite substantially. So far the policy response has been to restrict the size and length of mortgage loans, and this type of policies have recently been implemented in many Nordic countries. So in the article I just want to point out that when we look at the combination of the macroprudential policies and then the housing taxation, somehow this seems a bit schizophrenic. So on the other hand, we encourage households to become homeowners via taxation, but then on the one hand we are restricting mortgage borrowing. I think it's obvious that these restrictions on mortgage borrowing are likely to affect wealth-poor households the most. So this, if anything, is making housing taxation even more problematic from the equity perspective. And I would argue that this is an additional reason for making the tax treatment of owner-occupied housing versus rental housing more neutral. I would also argue that it's an additional reason for increasing property taxes, which in general are relatively low in many Nordic countries. If we were by increasing the tax burden on properties, or especially increasing property taxes that are based on land values, we would reduce lower house prices in areas where housing is expensive because land is expensive. So that should reduce the demand for large mortgages simply by lowering house prices in cities or areas where houses are currently very expensive. A higher property taxes should also sort of automatically work to stabilize house price fluctuations because they would increase with house price or land price increases. So my main argument here is that it's high time to think about taxation jointly with the macroprudential policy measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niku. A ton of interesting points there that we could unpack further. But in just a few minutes, obviously the system is biased towards ownership over rent. But I'm assuming your argument is making the case for at least a little bit more neutrality. Do we take the notion of imputed rent off the table, so to speak? Do you see that as more or less politically, too politically challenging to implement, and we have to maybe pick lower hanging fruits such as property tax or other forms of taxation?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So personally, I would love to see a tax reform which would impose a full tax on imputed rent and then lower, I would especially lower labor income taxation, and it would allow lowering labor income taxation quite substantially. Is that politically feasible? I have sometimes proposed that sort of a policy reform, and people were not too excited about it. So it might be, a non-starter, and partly for good reasons, I think, or for acceptable reasons. I mean, indeed, it would be a major disruption probably be a major disruption in the housing market. So I think it's good to keep. I think it would be good to keep the idea of a tax on the imputed rent in a sense on the table. At least we should be aware of it. That would be it would fit perfectly with our overall tax system, our overall capital tax system. While at the same time, perhaps thinking about indeed a more gradual sort of a more gradual ways of slowly sort of narrowing the gap between the tax treatment between the tax treatment between owner and rental housing. And if nothing else, I think we should be aware of the current system and realize that, for instance, if we every time that we increase, the usual capital, the normal standard capital income tax rate, we are effectively making private rental housing even costlier relative to owner housing than what it currently is.
Do you see as the option of deducting, where we have now, for instance, in Sweden, the ability to deduct your interest? So we have that preferential treatment.
Yeah.
What is the situation about that in other Nordic countries? Is that unanimous across the Nordic countries that we're able to deduct our interest from our capital gains or our capital taxation? Or do we have differences in the Nordic countries? And do you see this as a possible tool that could be used?
Sorry, are you referring to the capital gains taxation or mortgage interest, or the tax treatment of mortgage interest payments?
I'm referring to the ability to deduct interest rates as taxable income from your taxable income.
Right. So I think currently all Nordic countries do allow deducting mortgage interest payments. I think in Norway, perhaps also in Sweden, I mean, this applies also to consumer loans actually. So in a sense, all interest expenses, which is, that makes sense to me. Whereas Finland, I think Finland is the only country that is where this tax deductibility is being phased out. Whether I would like Finland to take it back? No, I wouldn't say so, because you would still argue that, given the non-taxation of the imputed rent, I mean, it's still, in some sense, that's the second, how to put it, that's an incomplete measure, so removing abolishing the mortgage interest deductibility, I see it as an incomplete measure to slightly reduce the tax gap between owner and rental housing. So it's a matter of interpretation, I would say. It's the Finnish system is very far from optimal, but you could still argue that maybe that's politically, perhaps that's the best thing that we can do, which is still politically feasible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Niku, for this, and I'll look forward to having you back in a few minutes to our panel discussion. So with that being said, I'd like to move on, and now that we've had this introduction to aspects in the issue, to invite our panel guests to join the screen. We have 3 panel guests with us today. First, we have Una Jonsdottir, who is an analyst at the Economic Research Department of Landsbanken in Iceland. She holds a master's degree in economics and management science from Humboldt University of Berlin, and has researched the Icelandic housing market both within her position at Landsbanken and through previous employment at the Housing and Construction Authority, as well as the Icelandic Confederation of Labor. Welcome, Una. How do you relate some of the things that have been said today in the 4 presentations that we've had to the housing situation in terms of housing policy and taxation and accessibility and construction in the Icelandic context?
Hi, just first of all, thank you very much for having me here today and for these very interesting presentations. Yeah, just a little, maybe if I give a brief overview of the Icelandic housing market. We saw some very interesting things happen last year after the pandemic. We were expecting prices to be, very modest, but however, we saw house prices go faster up than we had expected. There was a large number of monthly sales, numbers that we hadn't seen since 2007. Everybody just kind of seemed to want to buy an apartment, and that immediately. There were a couple reasons for this. I think probably the main reason being lower interest rates. interest rates went down as a response to the pandemic, and demand grew really fast, probably faster than most had expected. So that, of course, caused pressure on prices, along with also just kind of something that was happening more or less globally, the fact that people just kind of stayed home. Many people with home offices and such, so the demand kind of grew for single family homes, bigger apartments, and also savings grew for many people, since, you know, there was some consumption that was kind of, I mean, there wasn't, for instance, people couldn't go on trips, stuff like that kind of caused savings to grow, and that kind of fed into the housing market. Yeah, so we've had kind of a quite lively housing market in the recent months. As for construction and new buildings, I believe that Iceland has quite a few new homes per capita, more than the other Nordic countries. However, there are many fluctuations. And I mean, now we have, demand has been growing, but however, I don't believe that we have an increased need for new homes, because population growth has well, at least migration has kind of gone down. There were fewer people that moved here last year compared to normal years. I mean, of course, that is highly sensitive to the employment situation going on. But yeah, so I don't know if I think I've touched base on many aspects. We've also had it's kind of interesting to see what's been happening to the rental market in this situation. There, I think that the Airbnb market has had a large impact. Now when we with the lack of tourists, then there was kind of a supply shock to the rental market. The Airbnb has been, well, when it was at its most, it was about 3% of the housing stock at each point in time was devoted to Airbnb. So of course there was, yeah, like I said, a big kind of supply shock when those apartments probably went up for rent. Of course, some of them were also probably sold. But we've seen rental prices go down, which is something that we haven't really experienced before. And I think that's due to a growing supply, along with maybe smaller demand, because like I said, there's fewer people who are moving here to work. So maybe, but of course that's maybe just like kind of short-term things. We'll probably see this change very fast when, you know, this pandemic and everything is over.
Well, maybe we can save that thought for a few moments, because we maybe have other panel guests that can weigh in on that and discuss that about expectations, not only after COVID, but policy response in relation to the trends that we've seen emerging. So next we have to join the screen Kurt Lillegren, who is Project Director of the Knowledge Center for Housing Economics in Denmark. He's also been an advisor at Realdania, the world's largest fund that specializes in supporting the built environment, and which established the Knowledge Center for Housing Economics. He fits perfectly here, given his extensive work with lectures and debates, and acting as an expert of Danish housing issues in popular media. Welcome to the screen, Kurt. What are your reflections from the discussions that you've heard today? Perhaps relating most to these issues of taxation and access and affordability issues related to affordable housing?
Well, I think there's a lot of interesting articles, many interesting presentations here for sure. If I start with the first one, focusing on supply, trying to explain the price fluctuations and the potential price bubbles with lack of supply, constraints on supply. There was a focus on land and low productivity. And surely that will be an issue in many countries. I would like to point out also that we have another third factor, and that is the time factor. That's a constraint too. We have time lags. When you see price increases, it takes a lot of time with planning, local authorities, a lot of planning for the investors, and you cannot just really start modern housing construction from one day to the other. It can take 2 or 3 years. So that is one reason that supply will always lag behind demand. Demand can change very quickly due to the COVID situation we have now. We have seen that in months, but also in the housing bubble way back in 2005 and 2006. We saw it with the introduction of the interest-only loan, and that boosted also demand, but you cannot just increase supply. And a fourth factor concerning the house price fluctuations will be that it's only a part of the housing market that will react to prices. If we look at a city like Copenhagen, but it might as well be Berlin or New York, owner-occupied housing is only a small fraction. It's in Copenhagen about 28%. So a large part of the housing market really will not react to an increase in housing prices. Say social housing, it will not react because of that. It's politically controlled. And we have about 20% of all housing in Copenhagen that's social housing. It's really lagging behind, and it has many structural problems. It's not easy to build in a modern big city like Copenhagen. The costs are simply too high. So that's another factor. We have many factors constraining supply. And I think that is the explanation that housing prices has gone up so much over the years, and supply will not be able to catch up with demand. Demand is running ahead, and supply is lagging hopelessly behind. And then there was the issue of taxation. And I think this is a favorite issue for all economists. We all love land taxation. It's a law that was born when we started economics, and it's a very unlucky love relationship, I have to say, because we never really get higher land taxation. It's impossible to explain to ordinary people why they should pay both imputed rent and a tax on the land. And if you cannot sell this to the general public, they will not accept it. So we really cannot get this through at the parliament. We could try to do that, but the reality is that many years ago, tax on land, that was a higher part of total taxes in our country and in many other countries as well. And it has steadily declined over the years because it's almost impossible to explain. Also to say, this discussion about taxation and increasing house prices, this is very much a discussion concerning the major cities, where we see an increase in housing prices, a problem with affordability. Actually, it's only a part of the population, and certainly not the majority that's living in the major cities. So if you go out to the countryside and if you correct the prices for the general inflation, we have a lot of areas where prices really didn't move since the middle of the 1990s. So, well, taxation could help with the problems in the major cities, but I think you have to look at into perspective that the increasing house prices is not really a general thing. We also have areas in more structural decline, and that holds true for major parts of Europe. You can find areas in Germany where you have really increasing prices, but also a decline in the eastern part of Germany. It's the same in America and Japan. So this is just to put some perspective into it. Now with this discussion about affordability and social housing, I would say, yes, segregation and social housing, they did go hand in hand. We had a project like Miljonprogrammet in Sweden, for instance. We had the same type of programs in Denmark and in France. And we built very big housing projects with thousands of apartments. And of course, that ended up in segregation. Just look at the Netherlands. That's the country in Europe with most social housing. relative to the total housing stock. It's over 1/3. And they built the Bergman in Amsterdam, a huge sort of ghetto area, actually, with major social problems. They've been fighting them for decades. That kind of mistake, we will never do that today. No one would copy what happened with the Million program in Sweden or what we built in Denmark. So I think when we look ahead, look to the future, social housing can certainly be built without adding to segregation. On the contrary, I think we could fight segregation with social housing. Another thing is that you cannot really just pay housing allowances and expect the same as with social housing, because social housing has something that is unique. And that is they have a network. They have companies specialized in dealing with difficult tenants. And we have, for instance, many young people today with some kind of psychological problem, actually. And also we have seen a rise in homelessness again. Now, one way we can fight that, that's integrating them in social housing. And they have the ability to do that. A private landlord would never do that. We even experimented with something called a social landlord in social housing. People specialized in dealing with this type of tenants. So I would say, well, it's a difficult and complex discussion, but social housing can do many things. And I think we really cannot blame it for the segregation. That segregation is because we ask them to solve some of the most difficult problems in our society, and we have concentrated a lot of weak tenants in some areas, some vulnerable areas.
Thank you very much, Kurt. There's a lot there to chew on, and I think we should do that together when we have the complete panel with us. Thank you very much. I'd also like now to add Kristina Hafos to the screen. Thank you, Kristina. She is a Faroese economist, lawyer, and politician. Kristina was Minister of Finance of the Faroe Islands from 2015 to 2019, and the Minister of Education, Research, and Culture in 2008. She was elected to Parliament again in 2019, but has recently taken a leave to take on the role of Secretary General of the Nordic Council. Welcome, Kristina. How do you see the issues that have been presented today, both or either in the context of the importance of Nordic collaboration and knowledge sharing and learning, but also in the context of the Faroe Islands and the housing market and housing sector there?
Thank you, Ryan. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yes, thank you. And thank you first and foremost for very interesting presentations, articles, and also for the invitation to be part of this debate about the Nordic Economic Policy Review. It's no doubt that this review, it analyzes one of the most important issues in our Nordic societies, our housing markets and housing policies. And as many of you have described, we all know that our house, our home, is one of the most important things for our well-being. Having a good home, that suits the way of you want to live. It creates safety and stability and opportunities to build the life that you want. We also know, and I think this review also shows it so well, that the most people they paying for housing loans and housing rents. It is the largest monthly expenditure for them. So what's left of the wage, you can use for other things, clothes, food, and well-being. And therefore, the housing market is so incredibly important and also very important for the Nordic society and the Nordic welfare state. A well-functioning housing market, therefore, also is vital. And I think that this Nordic Economic Policy Review topic is therefore extremely important, both for the welfare of the Nordic people and the Nordic region as a whole. I think there's no doubt that we in the Nordic countries have a lot to learn from each other internally in the Nordic region. as well as the opportunity to inspire others. And we also know that there are a lot of things we can do better. I think these articles show it very well. We have a good potential to do things better. But of course, to reach new goals, you have to set goals. And I would like to mention this vision, the Nordic vision, that we have set together in all the Nordic countries for 2030, that the Nordic region should become the most sustainable and integrated region in the world by 2030. And to reach this vision, we have set a lot of several strategic goals also. Among these is to become increasingly more socially sustainable and competitive. And I think that this theme and this affordable housing for all is vital for us to reach our vision and also our goal. And I think that this issue on green housing is also a very interesting topic and important topic that the Minister of Environment and Climate from Finland also mentioned. When I read these articles, I think they highlighted some of the very important questions when we think about the housing markets. For example, are our houses over or are they undervaluated in the Nordic countries? I think we often hear that, or we have this feeling that, oh, they must be way too expensive because the prices have been growing so much. But I think these articles give us knowledge. Is it true? Is it not? And I think one of the interesting points in this review is that in general, we don't have hugely overvaluated housing markets in the Faroe Islands, in the Nordic region. We see that we may have a little overvaluation in some of the Nordic countries and undervaluation in other countries, but no like systematic overvaluation of bubbles. And that's a positive thing. Another question that these articles focus on is this buy-to-let investments. How are they affecting the housing markets in the Nordic countries? And you can say they confirm the things that most people think, that maybe it is pushing prices up to have too much of these buy-to-let investments. But it's possible to use certain tools to meet that challenge. I think it was interesting also to read more about these underlying factors for the rising prices, because we know like population growth and low interest rates and they are among the reasons, but which other factors? And this one article focusing on especially Sweden, showing that maybe we have a lack of competition within building material, rising cost of lands. We could look into legislation. And also the taxation systems, the asymmetric taxation systems. How can we ensure that people owning house are not like having lower taxes than people who have to rent, because that's also a social problem. And in general, I must say that a lot of good things in this review that I believe will be used from now on. We know that a lot of households or the majority of the households in the Nordic countries own their own home, and the rest of people they rent their housings. But we also know that things are changing a lot. The young people want a different way of living. We see urbanization. We have changing demographics, more and more elderly people. And in general, we also unfortunately see increasing inequality. And all these trends, they underline the importance of a well-functioning housing market in the Nordic region and in the world as a general. And I think it's important for us in the Nordic to look at what works well, what is best practice when it comes to taxation, when it comes to social housing compared to benefits. when it comes to getting the competition to work, and all these issues are discussed in this review. So I want to thank you for this and great articles, and I am sure that this will benefit and contribute to housing policies here in the Nordic region now and in the future, and therefore also contribute hopefully to the lives of people in the Nordic region.
Thank you very much, Christina. A few things. Johanna, can you add our authors and Peter to the screen for us? That's great, thank you. And also to our audience, if you have any questions from any of the presentations today or general questions from the panel audience, please, I encourage you to provide them in the chat or specifically in the chat function, because then I can see it right away. We got the word from Mats a moment ago. No new property taxes in Sweden, says Stefan Löfven at a press conference just now. Peter, I see that you have your hand up as a co-editor of the issue as a whole as well. Welcome to the screen. Tell us your thoughts.
Well, I'd like to pick up on the issue of house prices and the recent developments. André Amundsen concludes that there has been very few signs of bubbles in house prices in the Nordics. Prices appear to be well explained by fundamentals. But I'm pretty sure that if you added the development in the last couple of years, he would conclude that at least for Sweden, and I understand from Iceland, from what I hear, and perhaps for other countries as well, that prices now appear to be substantially overvalued. Mm-hmm. And many of us, given the pandemic, you would expect it, if anything, to go the other way. Mm-hmm. But if you think about it, it is really a demand shock due to new work habits that shifts demand from office space to residential space. And if this is a development that has come to stay, then it's really a sort of long-term demand shock that puts a lot of pressure on the housing markets. Mm-hmm. And looking forward, it's essential to have well-functioning markets, to have flexible supply that is flexible, perhaps in shifting space from office to residential. And I think tax systems. I'd also like to pick up on Niku's point, which I think really is a good point, that a proper property tax system works as an automatic stabilizer. So the upward pressure on house prices that results from this demand shock, if it is a long-term demand shock, would be dampened if we had a property tax or an imputed income tax that followed the development of market prices.
Mm-hmm. One of my colleagues this morning forwarded me a Dagens Nyheter article that had a byline, something along the lines of, let's see if I can find it here. It was about London, risks becoming a donut with a hole in the middle, where we've seen housing prices fall by upwards of 10% in the city center. Mm-hmm. Whereas increasing in the suburban or peri-urban areas surrounding the city center in London. So it's quite interesting to see. I don't think we've seen a decline in prices in any of our inner cities, still an increase, but these locational aspects caused by changing norms, changing market behaviors, demand behaviors from a spatial perspective can have very important implications as we move forward in the coming years. Not just cores and suburbs, but also smaller, medium-sized towns. How do you see that? Is there a way for policy to perhaps take a better or faster view towards this issue? Have you seen these discussions being brought up, at least in an economic perspective recently?
I've seen way too little of it. I mean, I think this really is important, and I think I agree completely with what Kurt said, that housing markets are typically very slow to respond to demand changes because supply is so inert, and we really need more flexibility. We need a more flexible rental market than we have, and certainly in Sweden that's a huge problem, and I think in Denmark as well. Mm-hmm. Hopefully there's a lot, can be quite a bit of conversion from office to residential, and that may be easier to be flexible in that dimension. But I don't know if Sten and Mats, who are the experts on the supply side here, if they have anything to add.
Sten or Mats, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I guess I can just add that, I mean, it's really interesting, this shift out to the suburbs and the quickly rising prices in the suburbs. And I think that's to me, that's indicating that this has a little bit of a bubble flavor to it, because there's, I mean, you can argue that there is shortage of land in the city centers, in the big cities, but out in the suburbs, even of the big cities, I mean, there's not really a shortage of land. But there are lots of delays in the permit processes. So of course, that's sort of what's holding up the prices. But I mean, taking the really long view over the decades, there is a lot of land, and I don't think it's really sustainable with such high prices, where you can actually build new houses at, let's say, half the price if you just look at the construction cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but when we come back to this issue that Kurt brought up of lagging supply and the issues that you brought up of the time for permitting, I believe one of the commentators or commenters to your article, in fact, made a specific comment about just how much longer the detailed planning process is in Sweden compared to other countries, for instance, in Germany. And so this issue of lagging supply and how we respond from the supply side and the development of new housing, I think is a very pressing issue. On one hand, how do we maintain our planning guidelines and our land use planning ideals for also contributing to a greener and more sustainable future, but also being able to be more flexible from the supply side. This appears to be quite an important issue. Yeah. Sten, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a brief comment on that. I completely agree with Kurt when it comes to the time lags. And as you just mentioned here, as one of the commentators to our paper mentioned, there are substantial differences. In Sweden now, the planning process is maybe 8 to 10 years, something like that, from the idea to actually getting the planning, the permit, if you start from cold. Whereas in Germany, it's less than a year. So, and that would be an extreme case. It could be down to 6 months or something. Now, the issue is a little bit complicated because there are several constraints. In Sweden, it's municipal planning, and there is also a shortage of qualified personnel, planners. So they, with a given regulation, if you take that as given, it's not that easy to staff up. Apparently that's a problem. Of course, you could solve that, but cutting down on the planning itself. But I totally agree that that's a severe constraint.
Kurt, how is that situation with detailed planning processes in Denmark? Is this also something that is constraining supply there as well in places like Copenhagen, the time it's taking to adjust regulations and land use permitting, etc.?
Yes. Now, when you look at the Danish legislation, it's decentralized. So the planning is put out to the individual municipality. Now, this process, I'm sure, will take time in every country. But when you look at the housing market today in 2021, you have another problem on top of that impacting the time lag in planning. And that is, we do not have a lot of land inside the center of the big cities. People want to live inside the big cities or close to them, maybe not in Gamla Stan in Stockholm, but close to it. And the same with Copenhagen. And we don't have any more land there. So the land you will be able to build on, that will be landfill when it comes to Copenhagen, or it might be some harbor area in some countries where you can change it into residential, or it might be former military areas or industrial plants. And this is not something that you can begin to use from month to month or year to year. A good example is the Lynetteholm, a huge project in Copenhagen that will be about 30,000 new apartments. It will be outside the harbor. It's an artificial island. And that project will go on and be finished in 2070. So that is the time span. So when you are planning new areas like this, it's not just a question about the building permit or negotiating how many stories. And that's a problem also today. We have a lot of negotiations and changes when people want to build a skyscraper here in Copenhagen. Sometimes it's rejected by the municipal authority, and it will go on again, and we'll have a new process. But the major new land areas, they take years to develop. And in the case of Lynetteholm, it was a political agreement also with the government because it was out in the sea. So that's another factor. And I think the supply of land might be flexible in the very long run if you look 20 years or 30 years ahead. But in the very short run, it's totally stable. It cannot change. I would like to point to another country, so we are not all the time discussing our own countries, like I'm only talking about Denmark. I can point to another country. They have a tendency for housing bubbles, and that is New Zealand. And they have a major city, Auckland. A big part of the population is living there. They have a lack of supply of land. And it is so extreme that the government even wanted to go in and buy up a campus area for university inside the city and launch their own program, the so-called Kiwi build program, to build more houses. You find this problem in many cities, like in Australia, in Sydney. It's very weird. You have huge countries with a lot of land, but people want to live inside the major cities, and there you actually have a lack of available land. So you can go on like this. This urbanization process we are going through makes the development in the construction center so much more different from the building boom in the 1960s and 70s, where you had a greenfield development and urban sprawl. Now you have brownfield development. You go inside the cities, you change industrial areas to residential areas, and that is not just something you can do from 1 month to another month. So this development is something more complex, but in the long run, you will see that supply will be more elastic. Like we are accepting high-rise construction again here in Denmark. You can see that in other European countries. And in that way, of course, you will add to supply in the very long run, but not from year to year. So if something like the COVID-19 anomaly hits us, we cannot really react, and the price will have to clear the market. So the prices are going up right now in the suburb, but actually also in the city center in Copenhagen with the same percentage.
What can we see then, based on this comment that you've just made, and maybe Peter, you can step in here a little bit. We have a question from the audience. Will immigration impact the Nordic real estate market? And I think we've been talking, this is kind of the ultimate issue, I think, standing above all of this, at least in a Nordic perspective, where we rely on immigration as a form of maintaining our population or slightly growing our population. What can we think down the line in terms of risk or vulnerability to continued closure or lack of immigration on the housing market? Do you see this as something that will eventually perhaps even out this bubble pattern that we're experiencing right now, or what is on your mind on the horizon of this issue of immigration?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to see immigration as a way of evening out fluctuations in the housing market. But let me step back a bit. I think when we talked about the planning process and how long time it takes, one of the reasons for this is that, and this links a bit to Essi's discussion about integration. My view, and I think it's a common view, that the best way of getting integrated neighborhoods is to have a planning process that mixes buildings of different types, high-rise, one-family houses, etc., etc. And that type of planning typically takes a very long time. So I think the planning process takes long time, partly for good reasons. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was exactly an answer to your question, but let me also say another thing about getting back to the discussion between Kurt and Mats and Sten. I think if demand is really shifting, so people can much more easily commute to their workplace and will work from home for 3 or 4 days a week, then the new construction should be in the periphery. And in the periphery, at least in Sweden, land prices are pretty much unaffected by the amount of building. Perhaps Denmark is a little bit different. So in that sense, if people really want to live in the periphery, then supply should become more elastic in the future. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That, of course, is a big if.
Yes,
which we don't know the answer to yet.
Yeah, these are certainly unknowns at this point in time. We have a question, I believe it's from Facebook, yes. Do more young people rent housing instead of buying? So for longer rather than earlier. Una, what are your thoughts on this, perhaps in an Icelandic perspective? With these increasing housing prices, at the same time as with historically low interest rates and the availability of money, there is still the hurdle of coming up with the funds to help younger people, young adults, and people just entering the labor force in their careers to get access to housing and housing ownership. Is this a situation that you observe in Iceland, or is there any policy responses that you've observed to this for integrating young people in the housing market? Una?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I mean, this discussion is always going on, and it probably always will be. I mean, I should say, the kind of hurdle to purchase your first home, I mean, it's probably always going to be difficult, always has been difficult. But now it's actually kind of interesting to see that, like you said, with rising house prices here and everything, we still have a record high percentage of first-time buyers. About a third of all purchases in the first quarter here were first-time buyers, which is the highest it's ever been, which I think is it's probably due to lower interest rates. Like I said, higher savings, which people have due to this COVID situation. But also the government has started a sort of help to buy scheme similar to the one in the UK, where the government has special loans for first-time buyers. However, I think that just started towards the end of last year, so we haven't really seen what effect it'll have. But but that's of course going to be a scheme which is sort of incentivizing or works on the demand side, but also on the supply side, because it's going to be aimed towards buying new homes. Yeah. So homes that nobody else has purchased before, which will be sort of built with first-time buyers in mind. So they're supposed to be small and sort of convenient for that group. So I don't know, maybe we'll see kind of a shift towards people being able to buy homes sooner than before. We know that's kind of I mean, owner-occupied housing has always been high here and probably will be. Although, of course, we need a sturdy and good rental market specifically for people who move here to work and such. And the government also has some social housing schemes or are issuing grants towards building rental homes for low-income families.
Mhm.
So I think we're hopefully going to see housing security grow in the coming months and years with these two schemes, both to help people buy and also offer rental homes for those who choose to be there. But the numbers show that I mean, yeah, like I said, first-time buyers have never been more than now. So, yeah.
Perhaps it's related to that, the introduction of this policy at the end of last year. So it'll certainly be interesting to know. I don't believe that we have anything in Sweden supporting young buyers entering the housing market. Peter, are you aware of?
There is a government committee looking at that,
Okay.
of introducing a system with favorable loans for first-time buyers.
Okay, thank you.
But I think it's a bit problematic. I think in many cases rental is the natural starting dwelling for a young person who doesn't know where he will settle down, etc. And buying. First of all, buying is maybe financially difficult for many young people, but
Yeah. I mean, I guess one argument though could be access to the rental market in some of our larger cities is challenging for everyone.
And in that case, the rent regulation in the rent setting system in Sweden is a big obstacle that makes rental simply physically unavailable for many young people who are sort of forced into buying.
Yeah. Christina, I saw that you had your hand up. Did you have something to add on this this aspect that Una was discussing?
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I just wanted to add that we in the Faroe Islands we see this huge demand for more wanting to rent, but a very low supply of new rental apartments. We have had a general, you can say, challenge on the housing market for the last couple of years because of the growing population, because of changing. Also, we see that the households become fewer and fewer people in each house, and in general, very slow increase in supply. And traditionally, people have been owning their house, and the taxing system has also made that more attractive. So now I think things are changing, and they have started on more also public building of rental apartments, and we have changed also the tax system, making it more attractive to rent out for long term rather than this Airbnb, to get more people to rent out long term. So I know time is running out, but so many different issues we could discuss and share.
Yes, I can relate to that. I'm in my own bubble right now here and could certainly go on for much more time with many more questions. But I know that everyone, all of our attendees and participants, and you and our panel guests, we have places to go and people to see and all of these types of things. Johanna, can you join me for a quick moment? I want to thank, on behalf of both of us, to thank all of you for joining us today as panelists and contributors to this launch of the Nordic Economic Policy Review, but especially to you that have attended as guests to listen in. If these people want some more information about where they can get access to the book, have you provided that, or what is the website that they can grab a copy, a digital copy of the book?
So I wanted to save the link till the very last minute. So I was just about to type it in the chat, and everyone who signed up for this event will get a link to the digital publication.
Great.
So, and you will also be able to find it on our website, of course, which is www.nordregio.org. So, and if you can't find it, then just get in touch with us directly via email.
Great.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for today. We hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.